For most people, October 24th, 1929 exists only as a date in textbooks. A black and white photograph, men in hats staring at numbers on a board. But what actually happened that day was not a crash. It was a realization. In just a few hours, the system people trusted more than their own neighbors revealed that it could turn against them faster than they could react. Fortunes vanished before lunch. Phone lines collapsed. Orders could not be processed. And by the time the closing bell rang, the truth was unavoidable. The system had crossed a point it could not simply walk back from. What followed was not a temporary setback. It was a decade of suffering that rewired how an entire generation thought about money, trust, and survival. And here is the part most people never consider. The crash did not begin that morning. It began when confidence replaced caution, when complexity replaced transparency, and when people were convinced that this time was different. That pattern has repeated again and again across history. Empires do not fall when they are weak. They fall when they believe their systems are too advanced to fail. Right now, we are told that modern finance is safer, smarter, more diversified. Algorithms manage risk. Central banks stand ready. Markets self-correct. But those are the same assurances given at every major turning point. The moment no one recovers from is not marked by sirens or headlines. It is marked by silent shifts that feel reasonable while they happen. A small rule change, a new financial product, a promise of stability in exchange for leverage. People do not panic at the crossing of the line. They celebrate it. In the years before the Great Depression, America believed it had solved the problem of economic cycles. Productivity was rising, credit was plentiful. Ordinary people were invited into markets once reserved for elites. It felt democratic, empowering, irreversible, and that belief was the real breaking point. Because once a system depends on constant participation, constant confidence, and constant expansion, it no longer needs a shock to collapse. It only needs doubt. The same mechanism appears every time. When systems grow large enough, they stop absorbing mistakes and start amplifying them. Small imbalances turn into structural fractures. Decisions meant to stabilize conditions end up locking them into place. The system becomes rigid, fragile, unable to reverse course without causing damage. Historians often debate the exact moment Rome fell, or when the British Empire began its decline, or when the gold standard truly ended. But those debates miss the deeper truth. The point of no return is rarely dramatic. It is administrative, technical, wrapped in language that sounds responsible. It is crossed when survival depends on maintaining an illusion rather than correcting reality. In every major collapse, there is a phase where leaders know the system is unstable, but also know that admitting it would accelerate the end. So they choose delay. Delay becomes policy. Policy becomes doctrine, and doctrine becomes destiny. This is where the modern global system now finds itself. Debt levels are not simply high. They are foundational. Growth is no longer expansion. It is maintenance. Financial markets are no longer pricing value. They are pricing intervention. And intervention is no longer a tool. It is a requirement. Each time instability appears, it is met with larger responses, faster liquidity, broader guarantees. These actions feel protective, but they come with a cost. They teach the system that risk will be absorbed elsewhere. They teach participants that downside is temporary while upside is permanent. Over time, that belief reshapes behavior. Caution disappears. Leverage becomes normal. Complexity becomes camouflage. The system grows not stronger but louder, more confident, more dependent on motion. The most dangerous phase is not collapse. It is normalization. When extraordinary measures become routine, when emergency tools become permanent fixtures, when no one remembers what stability looked like without assistance. At that point, the system can no longer return to its previous state without causing pain that leaders are unwilling to accept. So they move forward instead, always forward, even when forward means thinner margins, higher stakes, and fewer exits. In 1929, the market did not collapse because people were greedy. It collapsed because the structure required constant belief to function. Once belief cracked, the math took over. Today, the global system is far larger, far faster, and far more interconnected. Capital moves at the speed of light, confidence shifts in seconds, and yet the underlying requirement remains unchanged. The system must be believed in to survive. That is the crossing point. When belief becomes the primary stabilizer, recovery is no longer about repairing fundamentals. It is about managing perception. And perception is volatile. We have crossed this line before, but never at this scale. Never with this level of complexity. Never with this many people inside the system at once. The question is not whether history will repeat. The question is whether it will accelerate, because once a system reaches the stage where it cannot unwind without collapsing, every solution makes the next correction more severe. That is what defines the point of no recovery. Not immediate destruction, but irreversible dependence, the kind that feels stable right up until it isn't. And once that realization sets in, it spreads faster than any policy response ever could. To understand why recovery becomes impossible, you have to look at what systems are designed to do versus what they slowly become. Every financial system begins with a simple purpose: allocate capital, price risk, reward productivity. Over time, layers are added to improve efficiency. Safeguards are introduced to prevent shocks. Tools are created to smooth cycles. At first, these additions strengthen the structure, but eventually, the tools stop serving the system and the system starts serving the tools. Stability becomes dependent on constant intervention rather than organic balance. That is when resilience quietly disappears. In earlier eras, failure was visible and contained. A bank failed. A company went bankrupt. Losses were painful, but they cleared excess. They reset behavior. Modern systems are built to prevent visible failure at almost any cost. Losses are postponed. Risk is transferred. Consequences are spread thin enough that no single moment feels catastrophic. This creates the illusion of control, but what it really creates is accumulation. Every avoided correction adds pressure. Every delayed reckoning grows larger than the last. Eventually, the system becomes too interconnected to allow meaningful failure anywhere. When one part weakens, everything rushes to support it, not because it is healthy, but because its collapse would expose the fragility of everything else. This is how dependency forms, not through one bad decision, but through thousands of reasonable ones. Consider how debt evolved from a tool into a foundation. Borrowing was once used to invest in growth that could repay itself. Today, borrowing is used to maintain the present. Governments borrow to fund existing obligations. Corporations borrow to buy back their own shares. Consumers borrow to offset stagnant income. None of these actions are irrational in isolation. Together, they create a system where future capacity is constantly pulled forward. Growth stops being about expansion and becomes about refinancing yesterday. That is a subtle but critical shift, because a system built on future promises cannot easily reduce itself without breaking trust. And trust, once broken, does not return quickly. Central banks exist to manage this balance, but they are constrained by the same logic. Their mandate is stability. Stability in modern terms does not mean equilibrium. It means preventing visible stress. Interest rates are adjusted not to reward savings, but to stimulate activity. Liquidity is injected not to correct imbalances, but to keep markets functioning. Each intervention is justified as temporary. Each becomes harder to reverse. Over time, markets stop responding to fundamentals and start responding to signals. What will the central bank do? What will the government allow? What risks are implicitly guaranteed? This feedback loop changes behavior at every level. Investors take larger risks because they believe exits will be managed. Institutions expand exposure because they assume support will arrive. Even policymakers begin to operate under the assumption that certain outcomes cannot be allowed. This is not confidence, it is entrapment. When a system reaches this stage, recovery becomes defined as maintaining appearances. Economic health is measured by asset prices rather than resilience. Volatility is treated as failure rather than information. Pain is avoided even when it would lead to long-term stability. The system becomes asymmetric. Gains are private. Losses are socialized. That asymmetry erodes legitimacy. But legitimacy is not required immediately. Participation continues because alternatives feel worse. People stay inside the system not because they trust it, but because they cannot imagine functioning outside it. This is how the point of no return is crossed psychologically before it is crossed structurally. History offers countless examples of this pattern. Late Roman currency debasement did not collapse the empire overnight. It allowed the empire to function while hollowing out trust. British financial dominance did not vanish when debts grew. It faded as confidence shifted elsewhere. In every case, leaders believed they could manage decline gradually. What they underestimated was how quickly perception changes once belief breaks. Systems can operate while unhealthy for long periods. They cannot operate once participants decide the rules no longer protect them. Modern technology accelerates this transition. Information spreads instantly. Capital moves without friction. Collective behavior can change in hours rather than years. That makes the current system both powerful and brittle. It can function smoothly under normal conditions, but it has little tolerance for sustained doubt. Once people begin questioning not individual outcomes, but the structure itself, stabilization becomes exponentially harder. Policies that once reassured now raise suspicion. Interventions that once calmed markets now signal fear. The same tools produce opposite effects. That is the hallmark of a system past recovery. Not that it collapses immediately, but that its responses no longer work as intended. At that stage, leaders face impossible choices. Allow correction and risk collapse, or prevent collapse and deepen dependency. Most choose the latter, not out of malice, but out of necessity. No one wants to preside over visible failure. But each choice narrows future options. Each rescue reduces credibility. Each guarantee expands obligations. Eventually, the system becomes too large, too leveraged, and too psychologically fragile to reset. It can only continue or break. That is the phase we are now in. Not at the edge of collapse, but beyond the point where genuine recovery looks acceptable. Because recovery would require contraction, accountability, and loss. And those are politically, socially, and psychologically intolerable. So the system moves forward, reinforced by confidence rituals and emergency mechanisms, hoping momentum itself will substitute for health. That hope has sustained systems before. It has never saved them permanently. The final stage does not announce itself as an ending. It presents itself as adaptation. People adjust expectations. Institutions redefine success. What once would have been considered warning signs are reframed as the new normal. Slow growth becomes stable growth. High debt becomes sustainable debt. Permanent intervention becomes prudent management. Language shifts first, reality follows later. This is how systems survive past the point they should have corrected. They change the story they tell about themselves. And stories matter because they shape behavior. When people stop expecting improvement and start expecting continuity, participation changes. Risk tolerance increases not because people are confident, but because they feel trapped. Saving feels pointless. Caution feels expensive. The system quietly trains its participants to behave in ways that make reversal even harder. This is not manipulation in the cinematic sense. It is incentive gravity. The rules reward certain actions and punish others until behavior aligns automatically. Over time, entire populations internalize these incentives. They invest because not investing feels like falling behind. They borrow because holding cash feels like losing ground. They accept volatility because stability is no longer offered. This is how fragility hides in plain sight. In earlier eras, the limits of systems were physical. Gold reserves ran out. Empires overstretched supply lines. Today, the limits are psychological. Confidence, belief, patience. These are harder to measure and easier to overestimate. As long as markets rise and institutions function, it feels reasonable to assume the system can continue. But continuation is not the same as recovery. A system that cannot contract cannot heal. It can only inflate or rupture. That is the trade-off made when short-term stability is prioritized over long-term resilience. The global system has chosen this path repeatedly. Each crisis reinforced the lesson that collapse must be avoided at all costs. Each rescue taught participants that consequences would be delayed. Over decades, this created a structure where survival depends on constant reassurance. That is why shocks feel so dangerous now. Not because they are unprecedented, but because the system has no tolerance left. Every stress test reveals dependence rather than strength. When confidence wavers, responses must be immediate and overwhelming. There is no room for ambiguity, no space for organic adjustment. This creates a paradox. The more powerful the response, the more it signals weakness. Participants learn to read between the lines. They understand that extraordinary measures imply extraordinary risk. This feedback loop accelerates distrust. The very actions meant to stabilize conditions plant the seeds of doubt. At this stage, narratives become critical. Leaders emphasize resilience, media focuses on recovery metrics. Data is curated to support confidence. None of this is entirely false. Systems can function while deeply imbalanced. But functionality is mistaken for health. The absence of collapse is treated as proof of recovery. This misinterpretation delays necessary change. It also raises the eventual cost, because when belief finally breaks, it does so unevenly. Some exit early, others are caught by surprise. Inequality widens not just economically, but informationally. Those who recognize the pattern adjust quietly. Those who trust the narrative remain exposed. This dynamic has repeated throughout history. The difference now is scale and speed. Billions of people are directly or indirectly tied to the same financial framework. Their savings, pensions, wages, and futures are linked to asset values and policy decisions beyond their control. That concentration amplifies both stability and risk. It allows the system to persist longer than expected, but it also ensures that when confidence shifts, the effects are global and synchronized. There are no safe corners left, no isolated failures. Everything is connected. This is why the idea of recovery becomes misleading. Recovery implies a return to a previous state, but there is no previous state to return to. The system has evolved into something dependent on conditions that cannot be undone without severe consequences. Interest rates cannot normalize without exposing leverage. Debt cannot be reduced without defaults. Asset prices cannot fall without undermining confidence. Every path backward intersects with pain. So forward becomes the only acceptable direction, even if it leads to thinner ice. This is the essence of the point of no recovery. Not that collapse is inevitable tomorrow, but that genuine healing is no longer politically or psychologically feasible. The system can endure, it can adapt, it can postpone, but it cannot reset on its own terms. History suggests that when systems reach this stage, change comes from outside the framework, through shocks, restructurings, or transformations that are not orderly. Those moments are often remembered as sudden. In reality, they are the result of years of accumulated imbalance. The crossing of the line happens quietly. The consequences arrive later. We are living in the period after the crossing and before the reckoning. That does not mean catastrophe is guaranteed. It means the rules have changed. Stability is conditional. Confidence is fragile. Recovery, as it was once understood, is no longer available. Understanding this does not require panic, it requires clarity, because the greatest risk is not that the system fails, it is that people mistake continuation for safety and delay adaptation until options disappear. History does not punish ignorance immediately, it punishes it eventually. And when it does, it rarely offers a second chance to prepare.